Итак, всем добрый вечер, кто подключился или в процессе подключения. Рада всех сегодня у нас видеть. Напишите, пожалуйста, в чат, слышно ли меня хорошо, видно ли нормально нашего спикера Пола. И если все в порядке, то да, пишут вроде все слышно и видно. Отлично.
Раз.
Так.
Раз.
Если все хорошо слышно и видно, то напишите, пожалуйста, в чат. Давайте немного познакомимся, откуда вы, с каких городов, может быть, с какой страны. Нам очень важно понимать географию наших слушателей и участников сегодняшней встречи. Пока мы продолжаем подключаться и ждать, пока все подключатся. Привет Москве. Как я вижу, у нас пока что большинство зрителей с Москвы. Калининград, Омск, много кто из Беларуси. В общем, привет всем городам, всем кому-то доброе утро, кому-то добрый вечер уже. Большой привет. Меня зовут Саша. Сегодня я буду модератором встречи «Основы сценарного мастерства» с Полом Гулино. И сразу, пока вроде как большинство подключились, несколько технических моментов. Если у кого-то возникают вопросы, пожалуйста, пишите их в чат, и мы обязательно на них ответим в конце встречи, именно в конце. Также, так как наш спикер англоговорящий, у нас возможен просмотр трансляции с синхронным переводчиком, или на языке оригинала, если вы хорошо понимаете английский. Для того, чтобы переключиться на прослушивание синхронного переводчика, внизу в Zoom есть такой крайний справа значок глобуса. Нажимая на него, вы можете выбрать язык. Нажимая на русский, вы будете слышать перевод нашего синхронного переводчика Саши. Нажимая на английский, вы будете слышать оригинал. Вот. Поэтому поменять ваш выбор можно в любой момент трансляции.
Простите, меня слышно?
Вот. Это был...
А где уже глобус у меня?
Выключила. Так. Многие, я думаю, уже знакомы с нашей школой, кто-то подписан, кто-то следит за новостями, но все равно скажу пару вводных слов о нашей школе для тех, кто сегодня, может быть, впервые на мастер-классе индустрии или еще не был до этого подписан, как-то знаком с нашим учебным заведением. Школа кино и телевидения индустрия — это школа Федора Бондарчука, совместный проект с продюсерами кинокомпании «Водород» Михаила Врубеля и Саши Андрющенко, также, который был сделан при поддержке национальной медиагруппы. Миссия школы — это вырастить, развить новое поколение кинематографистов в рамках уже глобального международного сотрудничества с ведущими практиками уже более мировой, не только российской, но и мировой индустрии. Уже год назад мы начали проводить цикл встреч с нашими международными гостями, чтобы поделиться со всеми желающими опытом зарубежных коллег по цеху. А сейчас мы запустили программы и авторы, со спикерами которых являются востребованные практики мирового кинематографа, которые уже имеют опыт, принимали участие в создании мировых шедевров кино. Поэтому следите за нашим инстаграмом, если не хотите пропускать следующие встречи и мастер-классы с другими деятелями. Сегодня у нас в рамках презентации программы «Основы сценарного мастерства» мы проводим эту встречу, и наш гость — это Пола Гулино, сценарист, постановщик, литературный критик и аналитик сценария профессиональных изданий о кино в США. Также он доцент Колумбийского университета, аналитик сценария в Showtime Entertainment и ведущий преподаватель сценарного мастерства Чемпионского университета в Лос-Анджелесе. Он постоянный автор, критик, рецензент и колумнист наиболее авторитетных профессиональных изданий о кинопроизводстве и сценарном искусстве в США. Постановщик «Большого папочки» и «От сердца к сердцу» для театров в Лос-Анджелесе, многократный лауреат международных кинофестивалей, автор множества нашумевших пьес и сценариев, впоследствии воплощенных в сериалах и также театральных постановках. Вот, поэтому здравствуйте, Пол. Я на этой веселой ноте я передаю вам слово.
Почему вы так?
Thank you.
Огромная просьба, прошу прощения, огромная просьба всех выключить микрофоны, и если у вас возникают вопросы в процессе лекции, задавать их в чате, они будут зачитаны и заданы в конце нашей встречи. Спасибо. Пол, вам слово.
Организационный вопрос.
Бабушка. Hi, would you like me to describe my background as by way of introduction?
Я думаю, можно, да, коротко рассказать о своем опыте, наверное, о первых проектах именно рабочих, как
Oh, yes.
пришел в это.
I used to make movies when I was a child in a format called Super 8, which was very small film. And then when I was an undergraduate at Columbia University, I found out that they teach film in a film school. So I undertook graduate study at Columbia University with Frank Daniel and Milos Forman, one a film producer from Czechoslovakia and a film teacher, the other director, both are Czech, or were Czech. And then I proceeded to write plays, screenplays, was able to get an agent, and in Los Angeles in 1990, I sold a screenplay that was based on a real murder story that I had. I got to know a police officer who was involved in a murder story and got the rights to that story and wrote a screenplay. And that one was sold to Paramount Pictures, and that was made and broadcast on television in the US. So that was my beginning. It took about, let's see, 13 years to get something done, but it took a lot of writing and study and also practice in theater, which, because it has a live audience, you learn about your writing when you do that.
Да, ребят, еще раз повторюсь, огромная просьба всех слушателей выключить микрофоны и задавать свои вопросы, писать их в чат, потому что мы их зададим в конце нашей встречи. Спасибо. Пол, расскажите, наверное, с самого базового, с чего начать писать свой первый сценарий, какие первые шаги, кроме того, что купить блокнот и ручку?
We do not buy pens anymore. We buy computers, and we don't have paper anymore. We have PDFs. The first step is, I think, to find a subject that interests you, that you are passionate about, a subject is often what happens. People are inspired by what we might call a what if scenario. What if a young woman encountered a ghost? What would she do? What if a scientist discovered time travel? What happens? Something, some kernel of an idea. And some people work by character. You meet someone very special that you think is memorable and that inspires you as a writer. And you want to put them into a situation that challenges them. The old formulation was that a story is like a scientific experiment where you take a certain substance and you put it into some environment, then see how it reacts, like a chemical reaction. And you try to find the right character for the right situation so you get maximum amount of fireworks and excitement for the audience and for you. But the key is when you're starting out that it should be a kernel of a story that interests you, that you are willing to spend a year working on as a writer. And then you begin by what I call ideation, which is generating ideas. What are the different ways that the story could be told? There are usually an infinite number of ways a story could be told. And it's best to explore possibilities before you start writing pages of dialogue. Once you are writing the actual script pages of dialogue, you are going to become attached to them. And you're going to not want to let that go. So that if you reach 120 pages of script, and then someone points out you could have done it much better a different way, you're never going to let go of those 120 pages. Whereas if you have try out different ideas first in short form, I like to work with just a one page summary. The story is this. Okay, now what if the main character was a different race? What if the main character was a different gender? What if the audience finds out first who the murderer is, and then we create suspense? Or what if we find out it's a mystery? We don't know the murderer till the end. You try it out first, and you pick out the way you like best, and then you begin. Does that help?
Мгм. Хорошо, тогда предположим, что работа над сценарием уже окончена, и финальный драфт уже все залочен. Что делать с этим сценарием дальше? Как его продвигать? Куда его нести? Кому его отправлять? Что с этим делать?
Well, there is, I think there is no particular way to succeed, but there are a number of things you can do to increase the likelihood of success. One thing you can try to do is see if you know anybody who is in the entertainment industry and reach out to them and ask for advice. Do you know anybody who is looking for a script? Do you know anybody who is would be open to meeting with you? Are there any jobs in their company? It won't be a writing job, but it could be any job. When I was starting out, I took a job as a secretary at Showtime, where I was just typing up other people's memos. But it allowed me to get to know people inside the company and make contacts. So, and meanwhile, I was still writing. So when the time came, someone offered to give me introduce me to an agent. And that's how I got my first agent. Now, he didn't sell a script, but it was my first agent. Now, the other thing you can do is I think that there are a number of competitions that you can send your script to. I know in the USA there are, and anything you can do to distinguish yourself from everybody else who's writing is helpful. So if you send your script to a competition and it wins recognition as a finalist, or if it doesn't win, it's a finalist or a semi-finalist, then you can say, I have a script that won recognition. And that helps you open doors. Sometimes the contests have contacts in the industry, so they might send it, or you can send it to an agent, a letter to an agent, and say, I have a script that won this award. You always want to have some kind of log line that will summarize your script. So if people don't like to read, they'll know, well, this is a subject I think we can use. It won an award or it won recognition. Let's see what we can do. Maybe meet the writer, maybe have someone read the script. Anything you could do to maintain social connections is important. I was able to maintain connections in theater. In theater, you have actors. Actors are looking for material. If you have a writing group, it's helpful because you may have 5 people, 4 of them are unemployed, but one of them has a job and is able to help others. So you have a support system. So there are many things you can do, and you just have to do it over time and see if something happens. For me, I did get the job in the industry, and I met people and went to meetings and did networking, and then was able to get a very prestigious agent, and he loved my script, and he never did anything with it. So it was a dead end. And then a few years later, I sent out letters to agents. I had been recognized in some competitions, and one of the agents called me, and he's the one who winds up selling the script. And I still have that agent now. So those are different things you can do. Another thing nowadays, I don't know how it is in Russia, but probably similar, that you can now make videos, you can make film yourself. You can get practice making things. And again, the idea is to get some kind of recognition for yourself that distinguishes you from everybody else. But when I was young, I'm still very, very young, but when I was younger, when I was in college, it was very expensive to make a movie. It was filmed. Nobody could make the standard 35mm sound films, but nowadays students have access to very high quality professional equipment. And if you know actors, you can create your own work and distinguish yourself. And if you're interested in writing, you're interested in making movies. And if you're interested in making movies, there's nothing better than making movies to learn about it. Okay. Does that help?
Да, думаю, помог. И думаю, что ситуация в России, она очень похожа. Но вот у вас достаточно большой опыт написания сценариев, и было бы интересно послушать по поводу отказов. Вот что делать, если вы приходите на студию, и кто-то вам говорит, нет, знаете, нам не подходит этот сценарий, или он недостаточно для нас хорош. Что делать? Стоит ли идти и быть очень напористым, стучаться во все остальные двери, или стоит сесть и переписать? То есть что бы вы делали в этой ситуации?
That's a very good question. You may get feedback from the people you send your work to. I've never gotten much feedback from a producer, let's say. or an agent, they either say yes or no. But you may get comments. There are professional readers you can hire who will give comments, and there's no precise formula for how to work that. You try to understand the difference between a analysis and a response. You may give it to friends or give it to professionals, and they don't like it for reason A, but you may know that the problem is not really A, it's something else. If you analyze it, there may be solutions to story problems that you will come up with that can change things. As far as my own rejection stories, in the old days, everything was by mail. So I would send out 20 postcards, letters of inquiry to different agents, and expect to get 19 rejections. And then one of them would be send it along, and then they would reject it after they read it. So there's a lot more rejection than obviously there is success, and you play the odds. Now, one thing to keep in perspective is that when you write a feature screenplay and you want someone to buy it, they only buy it because they want to make it. And it's highly unusual for anyone in normal life, normal business, to have a business plan and go to an investor and get $1 million to tell someone, if you buy this, spend $1 million to make it, you'll make money. That's a big ask, as we call it. You're asking a lot. So it's not surprising that that's basically what a script is. A screenplay is a business plan to a producer. You're saying, if you pay me and invest $1 million in this, you will make money. And it's hard to do that. So that's why there's so much rejection. There's also a tremendous amount of interest in the screenplay form nowadays, more so than in any time in history. And historically, at least in the US, writers wanted to write novels, they wanted to write short stories, they wanted to write theater. Nobody cared about movies. But nowadays, there's a lot less theater, there's a lot less novels being published per se, short stories, there aren't as many, and the main approach, the main interest is in film. So there's a tremendous interest and therefore a lot of competition for screenplays. So, yeah.
Хорошо, а вот если я начинающий сценарист, то есть мне нужно получать какой-то опыт, писать и так далее, и мне заказали сценарий, как бы готов за это заплатить, вроде бы классный, хороший кейс и опыт, но история мне не близка, она мне не нравится. Стоит ли браться за работу, за создание такого сценария, если это поможет карьере, но в то же время я не уверена, что это мне близко?
Well, if you are unknown and you're very lucky enough to get an assignment, then I think it's a very good idea to take that assignment. And whether you react to it at all, if you're in that position, you probably have imagination, and that imagination will allow you to create something that is at least somewhat satisfactory to you. But it's true, a work for hire, you're trying to please somebody else, and you try to work collaboratively with them. And that means some give and take, and trying to be respectful, but bring your arguments in about how to change it. And ultimately, it's it's it can be a difficult process. I told the story about that first script that I sold, that they hired a director for it, and the director only wanted to change two things, the characters and the plot. And so it was a major rewrite, and the result was a script that wasn't nearly as good as what I gave them. And the production company, now you have me, the writer, hired to work with this director, and the director is working for the producer. And the director made all these changes, and then the producer was very upset with what the director had done. But because of the time scale and the deadlines, they couldn't start over again or get a new director. So they wound up having me come back in to try to fix what the director did wrong. But in that case, I didn't have a lot of choice. I would make arguments with the director about, well, I don't think this is a good idea, and I think it's better works this way. But if he's going to do what he does, he did what he did. There are other situations. I've worked in feature animation where I came in on a project, and some of the artwork is behind me on the wall. And I was able to get the job because they had a story that had a problem, and I was able to solve their problem. And then in the collaborative process, things can still break down. You may have a solution to it and you work with it, and then someone comes in, and a director comes in again with a new idea, and they want to change this, and at some point the whole thing falls apart. So it does happen. But if it's, to answer your question, if you have the opportunity to write something that is for hire, then you do your best and take advantage, and that can be a credit that gets you started. So I would definitely recommend going ahead with that.
Мы уже первый вопрос спрашивали по поводу того, с чего начать работу над сценарием. Вы сказали, что это поиск идеи. И продолжая эту тему, есть ли какой-то список или вот какая-то... Ну вот, да, есть ли список каких-то наиболее или наименее популярных тем или жанров для сценариев? И стоит ли браться за написание сценария на заведомо не очень популярную или неактуальную тему?
Oh, good. Very good question. My old mentor, Frank Danielle, used to say that if you follow the trends in Hollywood, if you read what we call the trade papers like Variety or Variety, so the Hollywood Reporter, and try to find out what's hot and then write that. He used to call it the worst form of censorship. And the reason is just practical, that there is a practical reason. Anything you read about that's a current trend has been in development for already several years. And anything you sell now is going to, or try to create now, let's say it's going to take a year to write a screenplay. By the time you finish it, what was hot now isn't hot in a year. And all you've done is write something that is nobody wants anymore, that maybe you didn't write for the reason that you love it. You wrote it because you felt it was hot. So that's usually I feel that's not very wise. Now, there is a friend of mine who was very passionate about Sherlock Holmes. Are people familiar with that character, Sherlock Holmes, the detective? Yeah, okay. Well, he was written by an English author 100 years ago, and still very popular. And he was passionate about Sherlock Holmes, and he was passionate about monster movies like Dracula. And he spent a couple of years writing a story about this detective in London in the 1890s, Sherlock Holmes, encountering Dracula. So it was this meeting of a monster with a famous detective. And he worked so hard on that. And it was out of love. I mean, he loved it. And when he finished it in the fall of 1999, by chance, there was a big hit called The Mummy. The Mummy was about supernatural, and it took place in the same time period, around 1900. And so suddenly that was hot. So he managed to arrive in the marketplace for screenplays with a period piece involving the supernatural, exactly the same time that was hot. But he didn't plan it that way. He spent 3 years writing it. So he was very lucky, and he was able to sell that script for $700,000 versus $1 million. So he hit the jackpot. So there is timing involved. But again, he did it out of love for what he wanted to write, and it just worked out for him. But I think that's the answer to the question. You want to write something that has general appeal, that pleases you, but you think has probably some wider connection to people in general. But to get specific to a genre or a list of what's currently hot is not necessarily going to lead to success, unless you really love that particular thing that you're writing about.
Вы уже рассказали про ваш первый проект, о том, как режиссер потребовал переписать две вещи: это персонажей и историю. Так исходя из этого вопрос: что вообще делать, если режиссер, продюсер, студия предлагают внести какие-то концептуальные, масштабные изменения в сценарий, или предлагают там удалить одного из центральных персонажей, или изменить какую-то важную сцену, изменить концовку? Стоит ли как сценарист заступаться за свой материал? То есть какова вообще роль сценариста уже в производстве фильма, уже в процессе именно создания? То есть насколько вы можете повлиять на это?
Okay, well, I think the amount of impact you can make is limited to how much you can, what kind of persuasive power you have as an individual. You do not in America have any legal recourse. Once you sell a screenplay, you're sold the rights to the screenplay, and they own it and can do whatever they like. And presumably they believe in you as a writer because they bought it. So you might be able to make your arguments and say, no, I think this is not the way to do it. This is what will happen if you don't, if you change it. But if you can't persuade them, there's nothing you can do to protect it, except maybe buy it back. Maybe if you own if you have written a novel, then you can sell the screenplay, but retain the rights to the play. There was a movie about a decade or so ago called Sideways. It was written about it. It was based on a novel. It was made into a movie. The writer was not that crazy about the movie, even though it was successful. And a couple of years ago, it was produced as a play. The writer came back in and wrote the play the way he wanted to write it. And that was produced at the Ruskin Theater, which is where I've been associated for a decade. So if you have underlying intellectual property that you don't sell the rights to, then you have some power. But once you sell the rights to the screenplay, all you can do is persuade and pray or hope.
А был ли у вас вот опыт работы в паре или в сценарной комнате с другими сценаристами, писателями? И что делать, если в процессе написания вы как-то очень фундаментально, очень сильно расходитесь в решении,
Oh,
как бы, что же
interesting.
написать дальше, что же будет происходить?
Well, I've had two experiences like that. One was spec, on spec. I partnered with a guy I knew for many years, and I had an idea for a script. We started writing it together. We went through disagreements, and at one point realized that we could never agree on how to do the script. So we made a deal. We had an agreement that we'd each write our own draft, and whichever draft, if we were able to sell the script, whichever draft sold, that would be the script, and we would both get credit for both drafts. And in that case, the script never sold, but it won recognition in a Writers Guild competition. So it served a purpose to affirm my writing and to help my reputation, but I haven't really spoken to that writer since. So that was an extreme example. I had a project where I was hired. It was a job, but I worked with a colleague who still teaches here at Chapman, and we developed an idea together. We sold it to a producer, and we were hired to write the script. And it was a positive relationship. But if we disagreed, we would just make our arguments, and we valued the relationship and the success of the project more than our ego, and were able to work out any disagreements with how we did it. So that one worked out okay. But so those are my experiences with a collaborator who wasn't a producer or a director.
Вы уже в предыдущем ответе начали мне рассказывать немного про сценарии, основанные на романах, на каких-то книжных источниках. Могли бы вы рассказать, а как проходит процесс работы над адаптацией прозы, то есть рассказа или романа в сценарии?
Okay, well, this is interesting. It raises the question of ideation, because the first script I sold was based on a real story. It was based on a murder that had happened. I worked with a detective. He told me the story, and when you have a real story, you have to make choices. You're going to you try imagining it in different ways. And when he told me the story, I thought there were maybe 5 really interesting scenes in that story. It involved a psychic. It involved a murder and a missing person and a psychic who was trying to find it. And it had a supernatural element, and it was a little bit creepy, the story. And there were a few scenes that I thought would really bring that out. And then there were a lot of things he told me that just wouldn't work in the movie. So it's a judgment call, and you're often making judgments about what the audience knows and what they don't. And this is part of the ideation process. The three questions that my mentor told us that are helpful to keep in mind is when you're developing a story is, The first question is, what does the main character want and what are they trying to avoid? That's one question. The second question is, what does the main character know and what does the main character not know? And the third question is, what does the audience know and what does the audience not know? And those answering the second two questions, I don't think a lot of writers realize you have control over that. And that affects how the audience experiences the movie. And so this was a detective story about a man who's on a missing person case. And then a psychic starts to link that case with a murder. And no one else had done that. And so it follows that story. Now, there were some things that were mysteries that nobody knew what happened. He said they could never find out what happened in this case and that case. So I had a choice. Do I want to keep it as a mystery or do I want to have a scene in which I give away what I think happened or might have happened? And so there were some give and take about that. And I finally hit on what I thought would be the best way to do it. But the adaptation involves being selective and shaping a story around certain events that you really are excited about. There's a famous screenwriter, Edward Anhalt, who was very active in Hollywood from the 1940s through the 70s. And when he did an adaptation, I think it was very wise, his advice. He said if he got a novel and he was assigned to adapt it, the worst thing you could do is try to put everything in that novel into a movie and just cram it in, because they're very different forms. A novel is like a train. Every chapter is another car on the train, and you can add a lot of cars and the train will still run. And a screenplay is like an airplane. If you add something to one part, you got to take something away, otherwise it'll be too heavy to fly. So his approach was to get a novel, get a razor blade and slice the pages off of the binder. So he just had 300 pages, let's say, of paper. And he'd sit down and he'd read them. And every time he saw a scene that he liked, he would put it on a bulletin board, tack it on a bulletin board. And by the end of reading it, he said he'd have maybe 20 pages up there. And then he'd figure out, how do I put those 20 pages into a movie? So don't try to figure out how to make the whole thing work. Just get to the stuff that's really exciting that plays in a movie. So that's, I think, wise advice. As far as ideation, one thing I did as an exercise with my students to show you what the options really are, that it's how to develop a story. I played for my students the audio tape of the story that the detective told me for that movie that I wrote. And I didn't show them my script. I just gave them the interview. It was about half hour. And I said, okay, now come back and pitch to me how you would make this movie. And I had 10 students and I had 10 very, very different approaches. And some of them I think were better than what I had. I mean, there was one who told the story from the point of view of the ghost of the dead person who's trying to get revenge on the killer by communicating through a psychic. So it's all about distilling from the source material what makes you excited and how you imagine the scenes that you want to see, and then writing that. And I think that's one other thing to keep in mind, that about this process of screenwriting. It takes imagination, but yes, it takes imagination to come up with the story and characters. That's a given. but you also have to use your imagination to imagine that you're the audience who's never seen this before, so that you can experience it as you're writing it, as if you know nothing about it. And then you're guided that way about what the most exciting scenes are going to be.
А есть ли какие-то масштабные различия между сценария фильма для массового зрителя и какого-то фестивального кино? То есть, если они есть, то какие отличия? Может быть, какие-то принципы работы над этими сценариями тоже разные?
I have never done research on what a particular art house type cinema, what they're looking for in those festivals. So I really don't know. I've always been trained to try to make your work appeal to the broadest number of people. Now, that's an excellent question. If your heart leads you to a feeling that your work is not going to appeal to a broad audience, then you just have to follow that and hope it finds its audience somewhere. And but as far as a pattern about what art house, quote unquote, art house market is like, I haven't done any research on what that is. And I think when we talk about independent in America, it may be, you're talking about lower budget, fewer characters. Therefore, since there's less money, there's greater emphasis on character as opposed to action scenes. It may be that you'll find less known actors, maybe what we call quirky, because it reflects a very specific vision of a director or a writer. If it's a big studio picture, there are a lot of people involved who are interfering with the process. In addition to, I ran into problem with directors, but when you get to a bigger studio level, you wind up with different executives at different levels who are trying to not interfere, but they're interfering, but they're trying to help, but it doesn't necessarily help. It winds up being interference. And so the storytelling can be bland and can be very broad, like a lot of special effects, that sort of thing. So an independent, free of that interference, can follow a more unique vision. Whether that qualifies as art house, I'm not sure. Sometimes the low budget independent movies can be just as popular, not just as popular, at least find a broad audience too. So I don't know if that answers your question there.
А вот вы уже начали говорить про какие-то инди-фильмы, где больше времени уделяют конкретно персонажам. А что, на ваш взгляд, важнее в фильме? Это цепляющая история или хорошо прописанные персонажи?
Thank you. Well, drama has from the beginning been about characters in action. So I've never been a fan of trying to choose between one or the other. A film is not a drama is not a character study. A drama is a study of a character doing things and revealing who they are through the things that they do. What does character development mean? I'm not even entirely sure. I mean, there's a process of character development when you are imagining a story and making a story. You could there are different approaches by which people try to understand who their character is. There's people who write biographies of their characters. They base it on their understanding of how psychology works, and they might develop character that way and then put them in a movie. There might be, but as far as a movie that emphasizes character development, my impulse lies more along the lines of, again, going back to the scientific experiment, try to find a character that's going to be perfect for this situation to explore them. And you can find a unique situation that's perfect for a character. I don't know whether anybody here has seen the Milos Forman film, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's a tragedy. I don't spoil it, but it's about a person who is a free spirit, and he doesn't take life seriously, and he's always looking for a way to have fun. And along the way, he likes to share the fun with people. He may be a crook, he may be a criminal, he's in jail, but he gets in trouble because he gets in fights. But he has a quality about him that he likes to reach out to people and help them have fun too. And that's not necessarily a character who's going to be in any serious trouble, unless you put him in a particular situation that the writer put him in, which was this an insane asylum, or a mental institution, I should say, not an insane asylum, and where it's very restricted, and he can't help himself. And because of who he is, he gets himself into terrible trouble. But he can't, as a character, he can't change. He's who he is. So would we call that a character study or a character development? It's a study of a character in action, running into a situation that creates difficulty. And there's different approaches to what a story is, but one that a structure that I like, by a writer named Jonathan Gottschall. He wrote a couple of books. One of them is the storytelling animal. He calls this the most common form of story is what he calls the problem, the problem pattern of story. And it consists of story equals character plus problem plus attempt to get away from the problem. That's at the most basic level. So you try to find a character who is just right for the particular problem, where the problem hits them where they are uniquely vulnerable, and they have to deal with this, and it's difficult. And audiences, for various reasons, identify and are excited by seeing people struggle with their problems. And I've written a couple of books. My more recent one, The Science of Screenwriting, looks into this question of why we're drawn to this. Why are we drawn to that? And Jonathan Gottschall also talks about this, that we watch stories so we can learn about life, so we don't make the same mistakes that the characters make. There's one quote from a psychologist who said that stories are like flight simulators of life. A flight simulator allows a pilot to practice, and if the pilot makes a mistake, they don't die. A story allows us to experience a character going through terrible difficulties, but if they fail, we're not ourselves in danger. But we can learn, even if they fail, we learn something from them. So character development, like I say, I think the best solution is always to find a connection between the character and the story that allows us to look into the character and explore who they are. And ultimately, people, again, going from what Frank Daniel said, people see movies for one reason only, and that's so they can see other people. They want to see other people. And the only formula that he said you can use is stories about exciting people told in an exciting way. That's what you're looking for.
Да, хорошо, я предлагаю перейти к вопросам, которые за время нашего разговора наши
Okay.
зрители задавали в чат. И один из вопросов звучит как по поводу заявки на сценарий. Есть ли возможность людям не из Америки, не из США предложить свою заявку американской кинокомпании? Если да, то как это сделать? И где гарантия, что идею прочитают и не украдут?
Oh, well, I think it's there's no difference in approaching an American producer if you're not American than if you're an unknown writer who's an American. But it might help to develop some sort of track record in Russia first, because then you're approaching them as an established writer or as somebody who's had some success in screenwriting, and therefore somebody worth looking at, whose work is worth looking at. But I mean, you can enter American competitions if you're writing in English or able to get a translation, then that recognition is the same, and then you can still approach a producer and say, I won this competition, I've been recognized in this, please look at the script. But as far as stealing it, it's difficult to, I don't know that it really happens very often. It's a fear that people have, but if they're willing to look at something, they probably would, if you don't have an agent, they would have you sign a release saying you cannot sue them. But it's economically more in their interest to just buy something rather than risk being sued. But I think it's not something to be particularly worried about.
Хорошо, если я предлагаю, вот также вопрос из чата, если мы предлагаем свои идеи американским каким-то компаниям, такие как, например, Netflix, HBO, Disney, то есть ли какой-то конкретный формат, в котором нужно презентовать свои идеи?
I think it varies, but there's certainly something called a pitch on paper, POP, which is like a one-page summary. There's of course, not the tagline, the log line that gets people interested. Nowadays, people are submitting sizzle reels. They might come up with, edit together a short video that pitches their story with maybe clips from other movies. And
Sizzling, да?
Pardon? Yeah. So you get the experience of being a filmmaker, but it attempt to get them interested. As far as specific ways of getting it to different ones, I'm not sure. I can't identify what those would be.
Еще такой вопрос. когда вы пишете сценарий, как-то вы взаимодействуете с режиссером и или кинокомпанией, и то есть, когда вы пишете сценарий, вы ориентируетесь на режиссера или на кинокомпанию? Вопрос тоже из чата.
I think it depends on the deal that you have. You have, in my case, with one project, it was with the director who was hired and told by the production company to work with him. And then he reported to the higher ups that were producers. And then the another project, like the animation project, I was working directly with two directors and two producers. So it was a story team. And so we're all working on things and then reporting to the executive director on occasion. So it depends on the specifics. If in the case of being hired for to write a screenplay with a producer, it was with me and the collaborator. It was just the two of us collaborating and then handing it to the producer from there. So it varies.
Хорошо, у нас есть еще один вопрос из чата, и он уже на английском. Марина, is there any difference between premise and moral premise? What's your definitions for terms, a them, a concept, a premise? Thank you.
Okay, a moral premise or a premise or what was the other? How would I define? Oh, or a concept? That was the question? Yeah, okay. So let's see.
Я сейчас просто сама не совсем понимаю, что есть. Да, возможно.
Okay, so in this craft, there are a lot of different terms used in different ways, as you know. People use many terms and sometimes they have many words for the same thing. Sometimes they have the same thing for many, or I'm sorry, they have one word that can mean many things. Premise and concept, in my impression, are very similar idea. Okay, does anybody see a recent picture called Promising Young Woman? Okay, let's say that the premise of that is a woman who is deeply wounded by this sexual assault and suicide of a friend who decides I'm going to get revenge on every man I can get. Okay, so you could see that's a premise of a movie or a concept. Concept is the
Да, это в российском прокате она называлась «Девушка, подающая надежды». Да, оскаровский вроде номинант, если не ошибаюсь. Так, еще
It did win an Oscar. Okay, I don't know the Russian name. Oh, thank you. So that would be a concept. Now, moral concept, I take to mean possibly what others might call theme, or moral premise is a theme. It may be the lesson learned or the attitude that the filmmaker has about the material, and that is really, I don't know if you've heard about act structure, 3-act structure, but in the third act, near the end of the movie, the resolution, that's where I think the theme emerges. That is your philosophical time of the movie. So in Promising Young Woman, I think there's an issue there with what the
Девушка, подающая надежды, да.
moral premise is of that movie. I don't, it seems to be, if you're wounded, destroy everything you can, including yourself. That would be the moral premise. And I don't think that's a very wise one. But the theme is carried by the main character. And it's often, I mentioned Jonathan Gottschall and the idea of stories that you learn from the character's mistakes. It's usually something the character learns during the course of the story. That's the theme. And it can reflect morality. A person who is unaware of their self-involvement or selfishness, that comes to realize this is causing pain in their life. And so they, by the end of a terrible experience, they recognize that sacrifice for others can be a route toward greater happiness. Okay, there's a moral premise that you could develop, and that it would be, we could also talk about it as a theme of a movie. There is a question of whether you start with a premise, a moral premise, like a message or a theme. And there is one school of thinking that says, yes, you start with a lesson you're trying to prove. My training and experience suggests that it's better to be true to your characters and see where that leads. And your moral premise, your sense of morality will come through at some point. But if you start out with a moral premise that you're trying to prove, then it can make the characters less human, because they're there trying to live up to a moral premise rather than being who they are. That makes sense, I hope.
Такой вопрос тоже из чата. Что такое хороший финал? Может ли быть финал без главного героя в том случае, если он в коме, в больнице, убит и тому подобное?
And I'm sorry, the first part was, can the final script be with that, or the whole script?
Что такое хороший финал? Не знаю, не совсем понимаю, что имел
Oh, the good ending.
в виду. Имел ли в виду он хэппи-энд или просто хорошо, качественно написанный финал?
Yes, I've seen it done. Okay. Yeah, a character who disappears. When you have a tragedy, there's an idea that you have this character arc. A character comes to learn something during the course of the story, and that is what saves them. But the opposite can be true. The ancient Greek tradition of harmatia, the character, the tragic flaw, a character who cannot change and winds up dying in the end. We have tragedy, and tragedy, we still have a chance to learn something. We learn about, somebody made a terrible mistake and they never could overcome it. And that can still be satisfying. And I point out One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, if you haven't seen it, as an example of that. And it can be very powerful. There are also movies where the main character disappears, and I've seen that work. There is a movie called Being John Malkovich, a unique picture from 20 years ago, where the main character is, he takes a different form and becomes played by a different actor. So he's not even on screen after 2/3 of the movie, but it still works. He's there, but he's not there at the same time. There's a movie called Psycho People have seen Psycho, is it Alfred Hitchcock? I don't want to give it away. Anyway, you should probably see that, and from 1960, and it plays with this idea of main character, and the bottom line is, in terms of tragedy, yes, sometimes the main character dies, and that is a consequence of forces that they were not able to overcome. As far as having them disappear earlier than the ending, it's all a matter of managing audience attention. Audiences watch movies because they connect with a character emotionally, and they want to see what happens to that character. And if the character disappears, then you have to ask the question, well, why is the audience watching now? And there are different solutions to that. You can pull that off, but it has to do with understanding how to manage audience attention. That was my first book on the sequence approach, dealt with how do you keep an audience interested? How do you keep us wondering what happens next? What are the tools that a storyteller has to accomplish that? Because if you keep the audience wondering what's going to happen next, then you're communicating with them. You're conveying ideas and emotions and morality to them. If they are not paying attention, then you're not doing any of that. It doesn't matter. So that's the fundamental task. And then you can employ different tools to make that happen.
Вопрос из чата. В чем разница между работой над сериальным сценарием и полным метром?
Well, for a series versus feature, if you're working, okay, so if you're working in a writer's room on a job, on a series, then you have a Bible you're working with. The Bible will tell you who the characters are, the relationships, the basic course of a season, that sort of thing. And you're going to follow that. You have existing characters that you're going to write roles for the actors that are already there. You're writing a role, not really developing a character. And you're working collaboratively with a head writer and with other writers, developing episodes and then getting an assignment to write it. If you're writing as far as strategy, if you have a series that is a continuing story, like a limited series that tells a continuous story, then the way you manage the audience attention is that you can have multiple characters, but there still has a tendency to be a single main character. But you develop the story in a way that the questions that you raise in the course of the story are not completely answered by the end of the first episode. So the audience has to hook into the next one. In a feature film, you raise questions in the audience's mind, and you try to answer most of them by the end, and that's how we know it's the end. We're wondering if a character is going to get their goal, let's say, and they overcome different obstacles, and along the way they encounter other characters who might be a threat. And by the end of the feature film, did they get the goal or not? Is a threat vanquished? Is there any other loose ends in the story that need to be tied up? You tie them up. In a series, you make sure that there are hooks. There's different elements called dangling causes and deadlines and telegraphing that are hooks that keep the audience tuned in for the next episode, so that you have, I don't know if you people have seen Breaking Bad, but the first episode is an hour long, so it's like half a feature. but it raises a question. A man who is dying of cancer wants to raise money for his family. Can he cook methamphetamines? He's a chemist. Can he create drugs and sell them so that he can raise money for his family for when he goes? And that's a question. We're going to wonder, can he pull that off? And by the end of the first episode, we get an answer to that. But his problem is not completely solved. And there are a number of other issues that have been created that have not been solved. New problems have been created, and it's not complete. The first episode is complete, but the story is going to go on, and there are hooks that are going to keep us going with the next one.
Также Катерина Иванова в чате спрашивает, что у нее есть проект документального фильма, синопсис, готовый трейлер, команда, заряженная на работу. Они ищут продюсера, финансирование и прочее. Кому бы она могла предложить свой проект в США?
Okay, wait, could you say that again? It's somebody who has a documentary, or is...
У них есть только проект фильма. Я так понимаю, видимо, сценарий и синопсис, и трейлер.
That I really don't know about. I mean, that's not an area. Obviously, Netflix does documentaries as well as fiction pieces, but it's a matter of doing research and finding out who's doing these things. Look on IMDb Pro, and research somebody who might be right for this project. And all you can do is reach out to them and try to see if you get any kind of response.
Какой должен быть хронометраж сериала?
For a series? Oh boy, it's really depends on the material. Obviously, some series are open-ended that go on forever, and when we see limited series, they seem to have like Mayor of Easttown. I believe that was one season, maybe 10 episodes total. It really depends on the story you're trying to tackle. There's something like Barry has had 2 seasons now. That's a half-hour episode. Mayor of Easttown, I think, was 45 minutes per episode. It's a matter of... Oh, am I? I don't like it when my microphone gets scratched, and I will not tolerate it. How's that? Is that better? Yeah, I guess the answer would have to be it depends. And it's hard to know when an episode, you try your first season and hope that it gets picked up, and you never know. Let's see, Breaking Bad ran through, I think, 6 seasons, and they kept pushing the premise as far as they could. I don't know if there's an ideal length. There are, of course, traditional television shows in the US that have been going on since the late 1980s. And they still manage to come up with material. But those are not continuous stories. You have the episodic, and then you have the narrative driven ones.
Также вопрос, можете ли вы порекомендовать какие-то материалы, шоу, видео, книги о том, как писать сценарий?
How to write. Episodes. books? Well, that's a good question. How to write scripts. I have, of course, two of them, and those would be probably the only ones you'll ever need to read. But a book that I use for my analysis class is one called The Tools of Screenwriting by David Howard. I like that one. I have a couple that I've written. I've read some of the popular ones, the other ones that are out there. The main caution that I have about, there's a popular one called Save the Cat. There's another one that the hero's journey, the writer's journey that everybody seems to know about, is that they tend to be what I call story-centered as opposed to audience-centered. Like David Howard book, The Tools of Screenwriting, the sequence approach that I wrote are about how do you play with an audience? What are the elements of storytelling that affect audiences in different ways? Whereas books like The Hero's Journey, the Writer's Journey, and Save the Cat are all about what events are supposed to happen at what point in a story. And it can be very appealing because it simplifies it, but it also makes the storytelling very predictable. And it can result in the writer not being able to realize the full potential of their own material, because stories just don't all follow those patterns. In fact, one of the jobs I got when I pitched to get a job as to write a feature script, the previous writers were using Save the Cat, and the producers weren't satisfied with what they had, and they had no idea how to solve their problem. And because I was coming from a different background, where I wasn't bound to this has to happen here and this has to happen here, but rather understanding that there are different approaches that you can use to attack a story, I was able to replace them on the job because they just weren't equipped. But you got to start somewhere, and just keep in mind your main task is making the audience want to know what happens next, and think about how that can be accomplished. So that's what I look for.
Такой есть вопрос в чате, он достаточно длинно звучит. Часто сценаристы сталкиваются с проблемой, что сценарий не сулит большой кассы. Продюсеры неохотно идут на риски в сценариях. Сюжет, не написанный по линейке, нестандартные герои, с которыми будет сложно ассоциировать себя зрителю. Стоит ли идти на поводу у индустрии и упрощать сценарий? Я не дочитала вопрос. Часто сценаристы сталкиваются с проблемой, что сценарий не сулит большой кассы. Продюсеры неохотно идут на риски в сценариях, так как сюжет не написанный по линейке, нестандартные герои, с которыми будет сложно ассоциировать себя зрителю. Стоит ли идти на поводу у индустрии и упрощать сценарий, менять тему и переходить на отточенные рельсы?
Okay, so the challenge that a new writer faces are that you want to do what the industry is doing so that you look professional and that you look informed, but you also need to stand out from everybody else, because if you're creating something that everybody else is creating, then there's no way for you to get a job that anybody else could get. So I think it's always best to follow your unique way of looking at the world, and there's you kind of lean into what makes you special. And it may be that you don't get a big budget movie, but you could get little budget movies. Let me put in the chat, there's a nice book called Like Brothers by the Duplass brothers. There's an actor and a writer, director, they both write too. And if you read this book, it's not so long, it shows how they made it into the industry as unknowns. And it's really, whenever they tried to be conventional, they failed. And whenever they leaned into or exploited what made them unique, they they succeeded. And they talk about how, oh wait, let me type it to everybody. I gave it to one person. Hang on. Duplass brothers, and the name of the book is Like Brothers. And they talk about how they developed a video business in Texas, and they got this, managed to raise $500,000 to make an independent feature, and they did it. And in the editing room, they realized that it was not special enough, and it really didn't work. And they threw away $500,000. It was their own money, and they started from scratch, and they were stuck. And then they decided to make something really simple, and they made a 7-minute movie with one of them as the only actor in it, and he's trying to record an answering machine message. His own, he's trying to record it. He keeps failing and failing. And it was very quirky, very unique, and it won them recognition at the Sundance Festival. It was 7 minutes long, and it cost them $10 to make. So they got success from doing something unique that Hollywood can't make, because they don't have you and your own special way of looking at things. Another one is Ray. I'm probably spelling her name wrong. There's an HBO series called Insecure that it just concluded, I think, 5 seasons. And it's started out as a web series by this actress and her insecurity about, being who she was. And it 5-minute little clips, 5-minute episodes, and it was engaging and very unique, and she gets an HBO series out of it that went for 5 years. So if you have a unique vision, there is certainly a path to success by being unique and special. It doesn't mean it has to be that not everybody's going to love Insecure. Not everybody's going to love what the Duplass brothers do, but enough people do that they can get recognition.
Уважаемые зрители, мы будем тихо подходить к концу, поэтому зададим еще буквально пару вопросов из чата и будем завершать нашу встречу. Пол, какие новые жанры или темы сегодня актуальны на рынке, по вашему мнению?
Well, I'm not actually an expert on these things, more on story, but it seems to me that what is getting recognition is different kinds of casting, like groups that had not been seen on screen very much getting on screen. There's a classic play that was turned into a classic movie called Cyrano that I noticed is there's a new movie out now in which a little person has been cast in the role, the main character's role. We've not seen that before. Cyrano was a character who was a great swordsman and a poet, but he had a very long nose. So he felt his woman that he loved would never return to love. So he helped somebody else get the girl of his dreams. And now they've reinterpreted it in a different way. We have Westerns that feature African Americans now. There were actually African Americans in the American West, but when Americans were making Western movies, Hollywood was very racist and they didn't cast any of them. Now they're revisiting that and they're looking at that. So trying to get more prominent roles for women, working with gender, like what is it, transparent? The main character is a transgendered person. That seems to get people's attention, and they are looking for material that features roles for people that are, for women and for people of color. And there's even supposedly checklists that they're doing now to find out if you have enough of this or that. So that's a trend. Beyond that, the biggest trend in Hollywood now in the traditional big features is the Marvel world and these comic books. And so if you're hooked into that, great. If you're not, you won't know what's going on. My students, I asked them, what are they watching? Most of them, they were watching everything, but the most commonly mentioned series was, what is it? Loki? You guys get Disney Plus? Loki. And so I watched an episode of this and I had no idea what was going on. I had my students explain to me why this was good. And it's because they're all hooked into this Marvel universe. But of course, you're not going to be writing on spec a Marvel piece. But that's a trend toward the big movies are that, and little movies are experimenting with basically with casting and with showing other voices that we have not seen.
Также короткий вопрос из чата. Сколько времени у вас занимает написание одного сценария?
It's like, well, if you're writing on assignment, it depends, it's negotiable, but it might be a 6-week deal where you're writing the script. I think, let's see, I've done it for something in that range, a couple of deals with 4 weeks or 6 weeks, and then you get the rewrites for a few weeks after that. I had the one deal that went about 4 months with 2 drafts and various rewrites and conferences. On a spec level, it's going to be figure 6 months to a year. And I really think the most fun part of screenwriting is the rewriting stage, because you're kind of in God's position at the end of the story. The whole thing is, you've got it down, you got to the end, and it's not going anywhere. So now you just play with it and look at the character and watch the character come toward the ending. And so to dash off a first draft quickly is a good idea, and then you can shape it. So, but I'd say people say usually about 6 months to a year.
Как отличить хороший сценарий от плохого? Есть ли какие-то критерии этого?
A good script and a bad script. I guess we don't say good or bad, we say does it work or does it not work. And a script works for me if it keeps me interested. If I get drawn into it, I start on page 1 and it's like, wow, it flows effortlessly because they're managing my attention and making me curious about what's coming next and what the outcome is going to be. And maybe there's different surprises that are thrown in. Surprise happens when you create anticipation in an audience, and then when you do that, you can have fun. A script that doesn't work for me is one where by page 1, I can see that it's not visual, that it's not written in a way that grabs me. And by page 10, I have no idea where it's going. That's, in fact, the complaint. There was a survey that a colleague of mine did among readers. And if you'll hold on one sec, I'll get it for you. She generated a list of top reasons why scripts get rejected. So that might be of interest. Let's see if I can track that down. Probably getting late there. Are you guys having dinner or something in the near future?
Думаю, многие уже хотят, поэтому следующий вопрос из чата будет последним на сегодня.
Will be the last one. Well, then I'll have to share this with you. I can't seem to find it now, but it was the number one reason was that I don't know where this is going. That is, might be worth looking at. Okay, so the next question will be the last one, and then you have something good to eat for dinner, I hope. Yeah. Yeah, next question.
Хорошо. Вопрос. Расскажите, что побудило вас разработать теорию секвенции? Как я понимаю, на момент ее создания уже существовало несколько структурных моделей сценария. Что в них вам показалось недостаточным? Я учился по вашей теории секвенции и считаю ее одной из лучших и практичных по структуре сценария. Спасибо.
Thank you. Thank you. What happened, I think it might be in the book, the history of this. What happened is that in the early days of movie making, they had a single reel, 1,000 feet, 10 minutes, 12 minutes long. And then in the 19-teens, they started adding reels because they were trying to compete with theater. Theater was 1.5 to 3 hours. And they wanted to get the middle class to come watch the movies. And you can't do much of a story with 10 minutes. So they started adding reels. And in the feature length, 10 minutes a reel, you could have 8 reels, 7 reels, 9 reels, depending. And by the teens and the 1920s, they started marking the screenplays by sequence letter, roughly corresponding to the reels. Let me repeat it. That the scripts in the 19-teens and 20s were marked by sequence letter, sequence A, and then you would read, then sequence B, and then sequence C. And they roughly corresponded to the reels that were being projected. Movies used to be in reels. And so you could see that sequence management all through the 1940s. A large minority of scripts were marked that way. Okay, so then it went away. And then in the 1980s, my mentor, Frank Daniel, he started the American Film Institute and then moved on to Columbia and then to USC. He had a lot of experience teaching students, and he used a 3-act structure. and he used it in a way that's, I think, a little different from what you're used to. The idea was, again, audience. The first act, you set up a main tension in the audience. The audience hopes for something and they're afraid of something. That's the main tension. And that's the second act. And then the third act is you solve that tension. He found that in the middle, the middle 60 pages, students were struggling. So he revived the idea of, okay, instead of thinking of it as 60 pages that you have to write, think of it as 4 15-minute short films. And that helps you organize your thinking so that the main character, let's say, is a girl who wants a boy. That's the main objective. The first 15 minutes, she tries a direct approach of asking him on a date and gets her nerves up, and that fails. Okay, now what? Okay, now she's going to try something else. She's going to try seducing him indirectly by, some other tactic. That fails. Okay, now brainstorm something else. She gives up, but he winds up being interested in her, and he can't. You develop all kinds of complications that way, and it helps to organize your thinking. And it's not a formula. It's where certain things have to happen at certain points along the way, but you do try to get yourself in the shoes of the character and solve the problem as quickly as you can. And because you don't know what the story is, you are you're the character in the story. You don't realize that there are obstacles that are going to come along the way that challenge you. So I didn't create that idea. I got it, Frank Daniel got it from the early cinema days and used it as a pedagogical tool. And then, but there weren't any books out there on it. So I decided to explain it along with the other tools for managing the audience attention that I was taught about using surprise and suspense and how to handle exposition. And I noticed there's one question about dialogue. I'm not sure how much I got. It's an English question here, so I know what it says, but how you approach dialogue, I'm not sure I talked about it much there, but in the second book on the science of screenwriting, we did talk about different strategies with dialogue. But anyway, so to answer the question, that there seemed to be a lack of any books on the sequence approach, and it's a very useful tool. And I find it does help my students. And so I decided to write that book.
Пол, у нас есть просьба еще раз продублировать вот этот список 10 причин. Вот.
Well, what I want to find, I just have to find it in here.
Хорошо, хорошо. Тогда пока вы ищете...
I found it. You ready? Okay. Should I type it in so you can see it? It's pretty short. It's 10 top reasons. Okay, I just lost it. Hang on. Okay, number one reason is it took too long to get going. Right? Too many pages and I didn't know where this is going. Number two, didn't care about the characters. Number three, the writer didn't know the world, presumably the world of the story. Four, the tangents or subplots were more interesting than the main action. Five, nothing new, I've seen it before. And that's where going into your own personal way of looking at things helps because you're unique. Six, writer didn't know what the script was really about. Seven, loss of energy in the second act. That's where sequences can help. 8, the stakes are not high enough. 9, didn't know how to end it. 10, why would anybody want to see this movie? That's from this book. Make That Movie by a colleague of mine, Barbara Friedman Doyle. Okay.
Спасибо большое. Уважаемые зрители, у нас подходит наша встреча.
Okay. You're very
Хочется
welcome.
поблагодарить нашего спикера Пола в первую очередь и участников, что
Well, thank you, and I appreciate your being here.
задавали вопросы в чат. Подписывайтесь на наши социальные сети, в которых мы будем сообщать о новых встречах с разными спикерами. Ссылка на наши все встречи.
Okay, I'll stay tuned.
Выбирайте лекцию по этой ссылке, которая вам будет интересна, регистрируйтесь. Участие бесплатное, но только с обязательной регистрацией. Запись этой встречи будет прислана вам в письме. Всем спасибо. До новых встреч на следующих.
Take care. Bye-bye.